Daniel Carver adjusted his tie in the cracked mirror of his Panama City hotel room, the humidity already soaking through his crisp white shirt. It was June 1972, and the air buzzed with the drone of cicadas and the distant hum of ships cutting through the Panama Canal. A ribbon of water that split this tiny nation in two, an American artery pulsing through its heart. Dan was 32, a lean man with sharp cheekbones and sharper regrets, an economist for Chaz T. Main out of Boston. But he wasn't here to crunch numbers, not the honest kind, anyway. He was an economic hitman, a title he'd never say aloud, tasked with burying countries under debt they couldn't repay. Panama was his latest mark. He'd cut his teeth in Indonesia 3 years back, selling a dam project with forecasts so inflated they'd made his stomach turn. The payoff? A gleaming paycheck and a village underwater, families scattered like leaves in a storm. Now his bosses wanted Panama locked into the same game. The canal was the prize, had been since 1903, when Teddy Roosevelt muscled Panama out of Colombia and planted the stars and stripes in the zone. Omar Torrijos, the self-styled maximum leader, was making noise about taking it back. Dan's job: drown him in a $500 million loan for a hydroelectric dam on the Bayano River, tie Panama to American banks, and keep Torrijos in line. He stepped onto the balcony, the city sprawling below, shanties hugging the hills, skyscrapers clawing at the sky, and the canal zone's neat grid mocking it all with U.S. military precision. Dan lit a cigarette, the smoke curling into the muggy air. He didn't want this assignment. Indonesia still haunted him, those faces in the flood, but his daughter's leukemia treatments didn't pay themselves. Just do the job, his handler had said, a faceless voice on a crackling line. Make him say yes, or we'll find someone who will. Dan exhaled, watching a freighter slide through the canal's locks. He wondered if Torrijos knew the trap was closing. The next day, Dan sat in a wood-paneled office in the Palacio de las Garzas, Panama's presidential palace, pitching to a trio of Torrijos men, suits with wary eyes and sweat-streaked collars. He spread blueprints across the table, his voice smooth as he spun the tale. The Bayano Dam would bring power, jobs, modernity, a glittering future for a nation tired of being a footnote. $500 million, he said, tapping the numbers he'd fudged late last night. The World Bank's ready to fund it. Panama steps into the 20th century. He smiled, knowing the loan's interest would choke them in a decade, funneling cash to American firms like his own. The men nodded, scribbling notes, but the youngest, an aide named Carlos, frowned. And the canal? He asked, voice low. Does this money come with strings? General Torrijos won't trade one yoke for another. Dan's pulse quickened. Torrijos' shadow loomed over every word here. The man had seized power in '68, a National Guard colonel who'd turned a coup into a revolution. Just months ago, in 1972, he'd rammed through a new constitution, naming himself Supreme Chief while sticking a puppet president in the hot seat. His obsession was the canal, a humiliation since Panama's birth, when the U.S. carved out the zone and kept it under perpetual lease. Torrijos wanted it back, had even threatened to drag the fight to the UN in '73, only to hit a U.S. veto. Dan leaned forward, keeping his cool. This is about progress, not politics. The canal's a separate matter. A lie, and Carlos' eyes narrowed like he knew it. The meeting wrapped, but as Dan packed his briefcase, Carlos lingered. Torrijos doesn't trust gringos with big promises, he muttered. Not after United Fruit. Not after the zone. Dan forced a grin, filing that away. Torrijos wasn't just a dictator. He was a nationalist, a man who'd stared down banana barons and dreamed of Nasser's Suez triumph. That made him dangerous. And stubborn. Back on the street, Dan dodged fruit vendors and honking taxis, the city's pulse pounding in his ears. He'd read the dossier. Torrijos, born 29, a mestizo kid from Santiago who'd climbed from schoolteacher's son to military kingpin. Trained at the U.S. School of the Americas, no less, but now he spat on the hand that fed him. Dan's numbers were a weapon, but Torrijos might see right through them. The thought lingered in his mind as he hailed a cab, the canal's lights glinting in the dusk. That night, Dan found himself at a banquet in the Miraflores Locks Club, a stone's throw from the canal. It was a mix of Panamanian brass and American expats, suits and uniforms clinking glasses under chandeliers. He'd been invited by a Torrijos crony, a test of his pitch. Then the room shifted. Omar Torrijos strode in, aviators perched on his nose, a cigar stub between his fingers. He was shorter than Dan expected, stocky, with a farmer's tan and a laugh that cut through the chatter. The crowd parted, drawn to him like moths. Torrijos worked the room, clapping backs, until his eyes locked on Dan, the Boston man with the big loan. He said, voice gravelly, a grin flashing. "Tell me, amigo, what's in it for Panama besides a fat bill?" Dan stammered, caught off guard, but Torrijos waved him off. "I've seen your kind before. Debt's a leash. Gringos hold one end, we choke on the other." The room hushed. Then he laughed, loud and sharp. "No thanks." He turned away, leaving Dan red-faced and reeling. Later, alone in his hotel, Dan paced. Torrijos had seen the trap, called it out in front of everyone. Failure wasn't supposed to happen. His room's phone rang, shrill in the silence. He picked it up, hearing static, then the handler's voice. He said no. Dan swallowed. "Yeah." A pause. "Then we escalate. Jackals are on standby. Don't fuck this up again." The line went dead. Dan sank onto the bed, staring out at the canal's glow. Jackals, killers who cleaned up when EHMs failed. He'd heard whispers in Indonesia. A union leader gone missing, a car bomb blamed on rebels. Torrijos didn't know it, but the game had just turned deadly. Dan lit another cigarette, hands trembling. He'd come to bury Panama in debt, not blood. But the choice wasn't his anymore. Omar Torrijos leaned against the railing of a barracks balcony in Panama City, the night of October 11, 1968, thick with diesel fumes and the shouts of soldiers below. He was 39, a lieutenant colonel in Panama's National Guard. His uniform rumpled from a day that would rewrite the nation's story. Hours earlier, he'd joined a coup against Arnulfo Arias, the newly elected president who'd barely warmed his seat 11 days before the Guard ousted him. Torrijos wasn't the mastermind. Older colonels had lit the fuse, but his charisma and grit made him the man to watch. Now, as jeeps rumbled through the streets, he lit a cigar and exhaled into the humid dark, tasting power. He'd come far from Santiago, a dusty town in Veraguas where he'd been born in 29 to schoolteacher parents, one of 12 kids scrambling in a clapboard house. A mestizo with a boxer's build and a quick laugh, he'd joined the Guard young, trained at El Salvador's military academy, then the U.S. School of the Americas in the Canal Zone. Ironic, given what he'd become. By 1969, he'd outmaneuvered his coup partner, Major Boris Martinez, exiling him to Miami and claiming the throne. No president's title for him, just maximum leader of the Panamanian Revolution, a name that stuck. Below, his men cheered, but Torrijos' eyes fixed on the Canal Zone's glow, a foreign scar across Panama's heart since 1903. He'd vowed to rip it out. Fast forward to 1973, and Torrijos ruled a nation split by wealth and history. The Rabablancos, Panama's white elite, hoarded power in their marble villas, while campesinos scratched dirt in the hinterlands. He'd already seized 180,000 hectares from the oligarchs, handing it to the poor, a move that won him love and enemies. The canal obsessed him, a symbol of gringo arrogance he'd erase, no matter the cost. It was a sweltering March day in 1973 when Torrijos stood before a crowd in Plaza de la Independencia, his aviators glinting under the sun. "The canal is ours," he roared, voice booming over the sea of straw hats and clenched fists. "No more flags in our heart." The campesinos roared back, waving banners, songs. Torrijos knew the history. Panama had been a U.S. pawn since Roosevelt's day, the zone a festering wound. He'd tried diplomacy, pushing the canal fight to the UN that year, only to hit a U.S. veto. Now he rallied the people, his dream echoing Nasser's Suez triumph. But the U.S. stonewalled, and his 1974 stab at a banana export union, aimed at giants like United Fruit, had flopped. Still, he wouldn't bend. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. The Rabablancos seethed, their land gone, their influence gutted. A coup attempt in December '69, led by officers Amado Sanger and Ramiro Silveira, had nearly toppled him. Loyalists barely held the line. Then came the gringo with the big loan, Daniel Carver, a slick Boston suit peddling a $500 million dam project. Torrijos smelled the trap. He'd ordered his aides to dig into Carver's firm, Ches T. Main, and they'd found ties to the IMF and World Bank. Puppets, he raged, of a corporatocracy bleeding nations dry. Debt was slavery by another name, and he'd die before Panama wore that yoke. He met Carver's pitch with a hard stare, cutting through the bullshit. "You think I'm a fool?" he'd snapped at a meeting, his aides shifting nervously. "Your numbers are fairy tales. Panama's not for sale." Carver had stammered, but Torrijos waved him off, ending the talks. Later, alone with his chief aide Luis, he growled, They'll try harder next time. Gringos don't like no. Luis nodded grimly. The memory of 69 lingered. Bullets in the dark, a near miss. Torrijos' new enemies circled, foreign and homegrown. In July 1973, Torrijos flew to Havana, a bold move that lit up CIA switchboards. Fidel Castro greeted him like a brother, their talks stretching late over rum and cigars. Torrijos admired Cuba's defiance but dodged its communism. Ration books aren't freedom, he'd quipped. He returned to Panama Electric, his resolve hardened. On July 15th, he took a bullhorn at a rally near Colón, the canal's edge, and tore into Carver's deal. Economic slavery ends here, he bellowed, the crowd erupting as he tossed the loan papers into the dust. The canal's next. It was a middle finger to Washington, and they'd feel it. That night, he sat with Elena, his mistress, in a beachside shack near Nombre de Dios, the Atlantic lapping at the shore. Rum loosened his tongue. They'll come for me, he murmured, staring at the waves. The gringos, the Rabablancos, someone. Elena, a sharp-eyed beauty who'd stuck by him, squeezed his hand. You're too big to fall. He laughed bitter. Big targets bleed most. Hours later, a blast shattered the quiet, a car bombed near his convoy as it rolled back to the city. The explosion missed him by yards, shredding a guard's jeep instead. Torrijos stumbled out, ears ringing, blood streaking his face from glass, but alive. Soldiers swarmed, shouting, as he lit a cigar with shaking hands. They're scared, he rasped to Luis, smoke curling in the chaos. Means we're winning. But his gut twisted. The game had claws now, jackals, maybe like the ones whispered about in dark corners. He'd humiliated Carver, defied the suits, and spat on their system. Havana had been the last straw. Torrijos crushed the cigar under his boot, eyes on the horizon. He'd fight, but he knew the cost was climbing. Daniel Carver stepped off the plane in Panama City in September 1976, the sticky heat slamming him like a fist. 3 years had passed since his first failure here, since Omar Torrijos had laughed off his $500 million dam loan and sent him packing. Now 36, Dan's hair was graying at the temples, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Back then, he'd been a reluctant economic hitman, a cog in Chaz T-Main's machine. Today, he was a desperate one. His daughter, Ellie, was 9, her leukemia eating through his savings faster than the treatments could save her. His bosses had dangled a lifeline. One more job in Panama, a big one, or he was out. The game had shifted. Torrijos was winning, negotiating the canal's return with Jimmy Carter, a deal inked on September 7, 1977, promising Panama control by 1999. The Torrijos-Carter treaties had U.S. hawks like Senator Strom Thurmond spitting mad, calling it a Cold War surrender. Dan's new orders were brutal. Sabotage Panama's economy, force Torrijos to heel, keep the canal in America's orbit. He carried a $1 billion loan package, ports, highways, glittering lies, knowing it'd sink Panama in debt. The canal glimmered beyond the runway as he lit a cigarette, its locks a taunt. He hated this place, hated himself more, but Ellie's hospital bills didn't care about his soul. Torrijos wasn't the same man Dan had met in 72. He'd stepped back from formal rule in 78, handing the presidency to a figurehead, Dmitrio Lakaz, while still pulling strings via the National Guard. His reforms, land for campesinos, schools for the poor, had faltered, corruption creeping in. Dan's handler had sneered over the phone. He's vulnerable now. Hit him hard. Dan exhaled smoke, watching a U.S. chopper buzz the zone. He'd bury Panama to save his kid. What choice did he have? Dan set up shop in a cramped office near the Via España, meeting Panama's finance minister, Raúl Escobar, a paunchy Torrijos loyalist with a taste for bribes. Raúl's eyes gleamed at the $1 billion pitch, new ports at Colón, highways slicing the jungle, a modern Panama funded by World Bank cash. Jobs progress, Dan said, spreading doctored charts. Your name on every plaque. Raúl grinned, palms itching, and signed off in weeks. Dan knew the truth. The interest would cripple Panama by 85, American firms raking in the contracts while Raúl skimmed his cut. It was Indonesia all over again, villages drowned, futures sold, but Dan swallowed the bile and wired the green light to Boston. Torrijos caught wind fast. He'd loosened his grip in 78, bowing to U.S. pressure for treaty ratification, but the National Guard kept him king. Late one night in October 78, he summoned Dan to a back room in the Palacio de las Garzas, the air thick with cigar smoke. Torrijos sat in fatigues, aviators off, his his face lined and tired. "You again," he growled, tossing Raoul's signed deal on the table. "Thought I'd scared you off." Dan shifted, throat dry. "It's a good offer, General. Panama needs." Torrijos cut him off, slamming a fist down. "Needs its soul, not your chains. I've audited this. It's a lie like your dam." The room crackled. Torrijos leaned close, eyes burning. "You're selling my country to your banks, your corporatocracy. I beat you once. I'll do it again." Dan snapped, guilt boiling over. "You think I want this? I'm trapped too, puppets, all of us." Torrijos blinked, then laughed, cold. "Poor gringo. Tell your masters I'm done playing." He waved Dan out, barking orders for Raoul's arrest. Banished again, Dan stumbled into the night, the canal's hum mocking him. Back in Boston, his handler's voice was ice. "You're off the board. Jackals take it from here." Dan's stomach dropped. He knew what that meant, killers, not calculators. By December 20th, 1979, Torrijos had upped the ante, sheltering the ousted Shah of Iran in a beachside villa. A fuck you to the U.S. and its allies after the Tehran embassy fell. Dan, sidelined to a desk in Boston, caught the news on a grainy TV, the Shah's frail face beside Torrijos' grin. CIA chatter spiked. Torrijos was a loose cannon now, cozying up to Castro, defying the script. Dan drank alone in his apartment, bourbon dulling the ache. He'd failed twice, but the Jackals wouldn't. He pulled out a letter he'd scribbled months back, a confession of his role, the lies, the trap, then shoved it back in the drawer, unsent. In Panama, Torrijos felt the walls closing. His reforms had bogged down. Debt from Raoul's deals piled up. The Rabablancos whispered of revenge, and National Guard rivals like Manuel Noriega eyed his throne. He confided to Elena over rum, voice low. "They're circling, Amor. Gringos, traitors, someone's got a knife." She brushed his cheek. "You've beaten worse." He smirked, but his eyes were distant, fixed on the canal's lights. Dan stared at his daughter's photo, Ellie's frail smile cutting deeper than any blade. He'd built the noose, $1 billion of it, and Torrijos had slipped it, but not for long. The handler's words echoed. "Jackals take it from here." Dan drained his glass, the burn no match for the dread. In Panama, Torrijos smoked a cigar on his balcony, the night alive with jungle sounds. Neither man knew how close the end was, but the strings were tightening, pulling them toward a crash neither could dodge. July 30th, 1981, found Omar Torrijos in a rare moment of quiet, sprawled in a hammock at his Coclacito retreat, a jungle hideaway 2 hours west of Panama City. 52 now, his face bore the weight of 13 years ruling Panama. Lines etched by victories like the 1977 Canal treaties and scars from battles he couldn't win. The handover to Panama by '99 was locked in, but the nation sagged under debt, corruption, and whispers of betrayal. He sipped rum from a chipped glass, the forest alive with howler monkeys and the drone of mosquitoes. "A break," he'd told Elena, waving off her worry. "Just a weekend." But his eyes flicked to the shadows, restless. In Maine, Dan Carver hunched over a kitchen table littered with empty beer cans, the clock ticking past midnight. Fired from Chaz T-Main 6 months back, he was a ghost at 38, jobless, broke, Ellie's treatments draining what little he had left. Torrijos' defiance in '78 had sealed Dan's fate. His failure to lock Panama in debt a black mark his bosses wouldn't forgive. He'd heard rumors through an old colleague, a jittery drunk named Pete. Jackals are moving. Panama's hot. Killers, CIA, corporate, or both, tied to the system Dan had served. Pete dropped a name, Manuel Noriega, Torrijos' National Guard protege, ambitious and cozy with the U.S. Dan's got twisted. He'd set this in motion, hadn't he? Torrijos swung his legs off the hammock, stretching. Tomorrow he'd fly back, meetings, rallies, the grind. The canal's glow felt closer here, a bittersweet triumph. Dan crushed a can, staring at Ellie's photo. He couldn't shake Torrijos' voice from '78. "You're trapped too." Neither knew the trap was closing. The next morning, July 31st, Torrijos climbed aboard his de Havilland Twin Otter, a twin-engine plane gifted by Venezuela, parked on Coclacito's dirt strip. The sky hung heavy, storm clouds brewing over the Cordillera, but he shrugged off the pilot's frown. "I've flown worse," he said, clapping the man's shoulder. 2 aides piled in, Luis, his grim-faced right hand, and a young lieutenant, Jorge, lugging briefcases and a cooler of beer. Torrijos wore fatigues, aviators perched on his nose, a cigar stub clenched in his teeth. He'd told Elena he'd be back by dusk. Unseen, a mechanic had lingered near the plane the night before, a sinewy figure in greasy coveralls. Paid in cash by a man with Noriega's clipped accent, he'd slipped a device under the fuselage, a pressure bomb, rigged to blow at 5,000 feet. Noriega had his own masters. Whispers of CIA nods, Rabablanco gold, a chance to seize power with Torrijos gone. The mechanic vanished into the jungle, the job done. In Maine, Dan woke bleary-eyed, a radio humming static. Pete's words weighed on him. Jackals don't miss. The twin otter roared to life, bouncing down the strip and lifting into the gray. Torrijos cracked a beer, joking with Luis about a rally in Cologne. We'll shove the canal in their faces, he laughed, voice cutting through the engine's whine. Jorge grinned, scribbling notes. The plane climbed, banking over the green sea of trees, the canal a distant shimmer. At 4,800 feet, Torrijos lit his cigar, the flame flickering. Almost home, he muttered, peering out the window. Then it came, a flash, a deafening crack. The bomb tore the plane's belly open, fire and metal shredding the cabin. Torrijos' cigar flew from his hand as the otter spun, a scream of wind and flame. Luis clawed at his seat, Jorge's notes scattering like ash. The jungle rushed up, swallowing the wreckage near Penanome, a fireball blooming in the rain-soaked hills. Panama's radar, spotty at best, missed it. The crash wouldn't be found for days. The news broke late, crackling over Dan's radio in Maine. Omar Torrijos, Panama's leader, dead in a plane crash. Weather blamed. Dan froze, beer slipping from his hand to shatter on the floor. July 31st, 1981. No accident, he knew it. The Jackals had struck, just as Pete warned. In Panama, the nation reeled. Campesinos wept, the Rabablancos toasted in private. Torrijos' body, charred, unrecognizable, was pulled from the wreck days later, identified by his watch. Conspiracy whispers flared. The CIA, Noriega, the U.S. humiliated by the Shah's stay in '79. No proof, but Dan didn't need it. He stumbled to his desk, yanking out that unsent confession. Pages of scrawled guilt about the loans, the lies, the system that crushed men like Torrijos. I built the trap, he rasped, voice breaking. The $1 billion deal in '78 had weakened Panama, made Torrijos a target. Dan's failure had greenlit the kill. He saw the handler's memo in his mind, a fragment from '79. Contingencies if he resists. This was it. In Panama, Noriega stepped into the void, his star rising as the U.S.'s new man. Ironic, given Torrijos had mentored him. The canal treaties held, but the dream felt hollow without its dreamer. Dan clutched Ellie's photo, tears streaking his face. He'd fed the beast, and it had devoured a man who dared say no. The radio droned on, funeral plans, tributes, but Dan heard only Torrijos' laugh from '72, sharp and defiant. The jungle had silenced it, but the echo lingered, accusing him. The Jackals had won, and Dan was their ghost. August 10th, 1981, and Dan Carver rattled south in a beat-up Ford pickup, the Maine pines fading in his rearview as he chased the ghosts of Panama. The radio buzzed with Torrijos' funeral. Thousands packing Panama City's streets, campesinos wailing for their maximum leader, his coffin draped in the red, white, and blue he'd fought to free. Dan, unshaven and hollow at 38, gripped the wheel, his unsent confession crumpled in the passenger seat beside Ellie's photo. Torrijos' death on July 31st wasn't an accident. Dan knew the Jackals had struck, their claws dipped in his failures. He'd driven all night to Washington, D.C., chasing a slim chance to spill the truth. In Panama, the nation mourned under a gray sky, but the undercurrents churned. Manuel Noriega, Torrijos' protege turned predator, tightened his grip on the National Guard, a U.S.-friendly shadow ready to rule. The Rabablancos smirked behind closed doors, their old power creeping back, while the canal treaties, Torrijos' legacy, lumbered toward 1999. Dan pulled into a D.C. diner at dawn, the air thick with grease and cigarette smoke. He'd tracked down Sarah Klein, a freelance journalist with a rep for digging where others wouldn't. She slid into the booth across from him, 30-ish, sharp-eyed, a tape recorder between them. "You've got 10 minutes, she said. "Make it good." Dan's voice cracked as he started. Ches Maine, the loans, Torrijos' defiance. "I was the bait," he rasped. "They killed him when I couldn't break him." Sarah's pen paused. This wasn't just grief, it was a story that could burn. Sarah leaned in as Dan unspooled it all. Indonesia's drowned villages, the $500 million dam pitch in '72, Torrijos laughing it off, then the $1 billion deal in '78 that cracked Panama's spine. "He saw through me," Dan said, eyes distant. "Called it a trap, Corporatocracy, he said. I failed, so the Jackals came. Sarah scribbled fast, the recorder humming. She'd heard of economic Hitmen, whispers from Peru, Nigeria, but Dan was flesh and blood proof. July 81, he went on. Plane crash near Penanome. No weather did that. Bomb, I'd bet my life. His hands shook, clutching Ellie's photo. My daughter's why I stayed in. Now she's all I've got left to fight for. Sarah dug deeper over the next week, holed up in a DuPont Circle basement with Dan's tapes and her own leads. She found a thread, Jamie Roldos, Ecuador's president, dead in a plane crash May 24, 1981. Another canal dreamer who defied U.S. oil giants. Too neat, too close. A retired CIA pilot, half drunk in a Virginia bar, muttered to her about cleanup jobs in Panama, 81. Orders from above, no names. No smoking gun, but the pieces fit. Torrijos' Shah stunt in 79, his Castro flirtations, the treaties that enraged hawks like Strom Thurmond. Dan relived every clash. Torrijos' fire in 72, his weary fury in 78, knowing he'd fed the beast that ate him. She pitched the story to her editor at a scrappy alt weekly, the capital I. This is dynamite, she argued, slapping Dan's confession on his desk. Dead as a weapon, murder as the fix. The editor balked, too hot, too risky, CIA blowback looming. Sarah didn't budge. Then I'll do it myself, she snapped, storming out. Back at her apartment, she played Dan's tapes, his voice raw. I saw his soul, Sarah. He wouldn't sell it. They made him pay. She saw Torrijos through Dan's words, a flawed titan, not just a dictator, and knew this had to break. The story hit in late August, a thin broadsheet no one read. The Hitman's Confession, Panama's Lost Leader. Sarah's byline ran alongside Dan's words, a gut punch of loans and jackals, but the mainstream ignored it, too wild, too fringe. Dan vanished days after, his truck gone from the diner lot, no note. Sarah called his main number, disconnected. She pictured him running, or worse, the jackals catching up. In Panama, Noriega's star rose. The canal's handover a distant prize Torrijos wouldn't see. Sarah held the tapes, her only proof, and wondered if she'd damned him. Years later, 1985, she cut an audiobook in a D.C. studio, her voice steady but trembling at the end. Dan Carver's last words, she narrated, etched in guilt and truth. I built the trap. They pulled the trigger. The tape hissed to silence, leaving listeners hanging. Did Dan survive, spilling his soul to the wind, or did the shadows claim him too? In Panama, Torrijos' grave grew weeds, the canal's locks churned on, and Noriega grinned from the shadows, the U.S.'s new puppet. Sarah clicked off the mic, staring at Dan's photo of Ellie, left behind in her apartment. A little girl's smile, a father's ruin. The story ended, but the echo didn't. Listeners would rewind, chasing the question. Who really won? Torrijos' dream lived. Panama got the canal in 99, but the cost stained it red. Sarah whispered to the empty booth. Rest, Dan. You told it. Outside, DC hummed, oblivious, the corporatocracy rolling on, jackals waiting for the next mark.